Have you ever wondered why the world map changed more in one century than in the previous 1,000 years combined? The 19th century stands in our history books as humanity's great leap forward, the era when industrial might conquered distance, when railways bridged continents, when the modern nation-state crystallized from older, messier forms of governance. We remember it as progress incarnate, the age when reason and technology remade civilization itself. But there's a darker symmetry hiding in plain sight. Between the years 1800 and 1900, armed conflicts erupted in virtually every corner of the inhabited world. European powers drove into Asia and Africa with unstoppable momentum. The American frontier devoured territory at a relentless pace. Massive swaths of Eurasia underwent forced integration, their traditional structures dismantled or absorbed wholesale. Historians file these events under one reassuring category: colonial expansion. The narrative we've inherited describes them as lopsided confrontations where industrial nations overwhelmed technologically primitive societies in swift, inevitable campaigns. Yet a closer examination reveals troubling contradictions. These weren't quick skirmishes concluded in weeks or months. They were grinding operations that consumed entire decades, demanding enormous logistical networks, permanent military installations, and unwavering political commitment. They involved the systematic destruction of urban centers, the emptying of vast regions, and population losses significant enough to leave permanent marks on demographic records that persist to this day. Strangely, the historical documentation grows murky precisely when we need it most. Population numbers shift without adequate explanation. Settlements present on one map vanish from the next edition. Entire architectural traditions are dismissed as ruins or relics of unknown origin, as though they simply ceased to matter overnight. The accounts speak of resistance that is intense yet poorly characterized, opponents who appear everywhere yet remain undefined, victories that produce eerie quiet rather than grateful submission. The same terminology appears across different empires and continents: stabilization, clearance, resettlement, reorganization, bureaucratic language, neutral words suggesting orderly administration rather than violence. But the results tell a different story. By the time the 20th century arrived, the planet had undergone radical simplification. Political boundaries became standardized. Systems of land ownership were fundamentally rewritten. Older forms of social organization, the kinds that didn't fit smoothly into industrial bureaucracy, had either been absorbed or eliminated entirely. What emerged was a global framework that appeared remarkably uniform compared to the patchwork of systems that existed just decades earlier. This raises a disturbing possibility. If these military campaigns were genuinely about defeating scattered, backward populations, why did they demand such overwhelming scale? Why do their after-effects resemble not conquest but systematic removal? And why do so many conflicts, separated by vast distances and cultural gulfs, follow identical patterns: rapid obliteration followed by historical silence? Before confronting that question directly, we need to understand the official explanation. What does conventional history claim these wars were about? Who does it say participated, and why were they deemed not just acceptable, but essential? Only by examining that foundation can we identify where it begins to fracture. To grasp what these 19th century conflicts were supposedly about, we must first immerse ourselves in the conventional narrative. According to standard interpretation, the 1800s marked the zenith of imperial expansion. Industrialized powers, driven by population pressures and resource demands, extended their reach globally. Steamships compressed oceanic distances, railway lines penetrated inaccessible interiors, telegraph cables annihilated communication delays. Military technology evolved faster than any defense could adapt. In this framework, conflict was unavoidable. European nations encountered societies characterized as fragmented, technologically primitive, and politically chaotic. The power imbalance receives constant emphasis: modern rifles confronting spears, trained formations facing irregular fighters, centralized states encountering tribal structures. By the 1830s and 40s, British forces had penetrated deep into India. French armies pushed through Algeria. Russian expansion accelerated across Siberia and Central Asia. In the Americas, westward consolidation proceeded relentlessly. Standard textbooks treat these as separate histories, focusing on local triggers, trade disputes, rebellions, dynastic claims. Yet something peculiar emerges. Despite occurring thousands of miles apart, these conflicts followed remarkably parallel trajectories. Each began with a declaration of instability. Military intervention followed, justified as temporary. This gave way to extended campaigns lasting far longer than projected. Finally came administrative restructuring, redrawn borders, new laws, transformed land systems. At the core sat violence exceeding its stated objectives. The timelines are striking. The mid-19th century witnessed a global peak in such conflicts, not sequentially, but simultaneously. These weren't minor expeditions. They required standing armies, extensive supply chains, and sustained political will. Railways were built during conflict, not after. Fortifications appeared deep within contested zones, long before regions were secured. Official histories frame these as inevitable friction of empire building, yet the scale prompts questions. Why deploy such resources against adversaries described as scattered and poorly equipped? Why maintain prolonged operations when victory was allegedly assured? The standard answer is resistance. We're told populations fought tenaciously, employing guerrilla tactics and terrain knowledge. This explanation surfaces repeatedly across continents. Yet resistance is described as omnipresent, yet rarely documented with specificity. Adversaries are referenced collectively, often without clear leadership or even names. Then there's the aftermath. Affected regions weren't merely governed, they were fundamentally transformed. Traditional land systems were dismantled, census methodologies changed, settlement patterns underwent reorganization. Populations are recorded as declining sharply, only to stabilize later under different administrative categories. Official explanations attribute this to famine, disease, migration. But when historians trace these transformations precisely, documentation thins dramatically. Gaps appear, numbers round suspiciously. Maps produced before and after show dramatic differences, not just in boundaries, but in the presence or absence of towns and population centers. This isn't concealed, it's normalized. The 19th century was chaotic. Record-keeping was imperfect. Progress demands sacrifice. Yet within this explanation, another pattern emerges. Descriptions of pre-conflict societies are consistently reductive. They're portrayed as stagnant or failing. Their systems are framed as obstacles rather than functioning alternatives. This framing allows destruction to be reinterpreted as improvement. Removal becomes reform. Erasure becomes development. The wars are remembered not for what vanished, but for what replaced it. By the late 1900s, this narrative had solidified. The age of empire was declared complete, and the conflicts that enabled it were archived as closed chapters. But when we examine these wars as a unified phenomenon, the official story begins to strain. Too many parallels, too much coordination, too many missing details. The accepted history isn't necessarily false, it simply feels incomplete. Before exploring after nations, we must sit with that discomfort, with the recognition that what we've inherited is a framework designed to justify outcomes, not interrogate them. Once the conventional narrative is established, certain details begin to stand out. Small inconsistencies at first, then larger fractures, and finally anomalies that cannot be dismissed. The first anomaly is duration. Asymmetric conflicts, by their nature, should conclude rapidly. When one side possesses overwhelming technological and organizational advantages, opposition should crumble quickly. Yet numerous 19th century campaigns extended across decades, not mere years, decades. Entire generations were born and died within these conflicts. Military expenditures ballooned. Emergency taxation became permanent. Armies, supposedly confronting scattered, inferior opponents, remained at full mobilization long after victory was officially declared. This alone raises questions. What kind of adversary demands continuous deployment despite being characterized as primitive? The second anomaly involves infrastructure. Region after region reveals evidence of substantial infrastructure predating official conquest. Roads, irrigation systems, dense urban planning, stone construction, and agricultural networks appear in early surveys and sketches, only to be later described as ruins, abandoned constructions, or remnants of mysterious predecessors. Occupying forces frequently didn't build settlements from nothing, they repurposed what already existed. Yet the populations credited with maintaining these environments are seldom acknowledged. Instead, structures are attributed to lost peoples, forgotten kingdoms, or simply left unexplained. Why would technologically backward societies maintain sophisticated urban systems that arriving powers immediately recognized as valuable? The third anomaly lies in demographic records. 19th century censuses are notoriously inconsistent. In certain regions, population figures plummet within a single decade. In others, entire demographic categories vanish and are replaced with new classifications. Ethnic labels shift. Social classes are consolidated or eliminated. Occasionally, population recovery is documented with implausible speed, as if new inhabitants simply materialized to fill the void. Official explanations cite famine, disease, migration, or statistical error. But these don't account for the pattern's consistency across continents. Nor do they explain why population decline so frequently coincides with land redistribution, new settlement policies, and the sudden availability of supposedly empty territory. This leads to the fourth anomaly, land itself. Following these conflicts, vast territories are repeatedly described as vacant, underutilized, or newly available for development. Governments distribute it to settlers, corporations, or military veterans. Legal frameworks are rewritten to redefine ownership fundamentally. Communal or customary rights vanish, replaced by deeds, titles, and registries. This process is framed as modernization. But modernization of what, and at whose expense? If the land was already inhabited, cultivated, and organized, as early maps and accounts suggest, then vacancy isn't a neutral condition. It's the result of something having been removed. The fifth anomaly is silence. Victories are celebrated, battles are named, commanders are memorialized, but the defeated are reduced to abstractions: rebels, insurgents, natives. Their leaders rarely appear in documentation. Their social systems are vaguely summarized or dismissed entirely. Their perspectives don't survive in proportion to the conflicts attributed to them. This absence is remarkable. In earlier historical periods, even defeated civilizations left behind names, chronicles, monuments, and mythology. Yet in the 19th century, an era of supposedly superior documentation, entire societies seemed to vanish without leaving coherent historical traces. How does a population resist empire for decades, yet leave almost no record of its internal life? The sixth anomaly is architectural discontinuity. Across the world, we encounter buildings from the 19th century that don't align with the technological capabilities attributed to those who supposedly constructed them. Massive stone edifices, elaborate civic buildings, and infrastructure projects appear suddenly in official timelines, fully formed, often credited to early colonial administrations with limited local resources. Frequently, these structures are later renovated, reduced in scale, or demolished, their origins quietly forgotten. If these buildings symbolized colonial authority, why do they often predate the administrative systems that supposedly commissioned them? Finally, there's the anomaly of synchronization. Conflicts in India, North Africa, Central Asia, North America, and Eastern Europe peak within overlapping time frames. Not identical dates, but close enough to suggest coordination rather than coincidence. Similar military doctrines emerge. Similar administrative reforms follow. Similar demographic transformations occur. Different empires, different languages, different justifications, identical results. Individually, each anomaly can be rationalized. Historians have done so for generations. Records were lost. Circumstances were unique. Sources were biased. The 19th century was complex. But viewed collectively, they function less like isolated problems and more like connected evidence, threads all pulling in the same direction. At this point, precision is essential. We're not proposing hidden civilizations or secret histories. We're doing something more fundamental and perhaps more unsettling, acknowledging that the official account doesn't fully explain the evidence. The scale of violence, the transformation of land, the disappearance of populations, and the reuse of existing structures don't align neatly with a narrative of simple colonial suppression. Something else appears embedded within these wars, something structural, systematic, repeated. The 19th century, viewed through this lens, resembles less an age of expansion and more an age of compression, of simplification, of standardization achieved through force. And once that possibility surfaces, the question transforms. Not who was conquered, but what was removed to make space for the world that followed. When anomalies are examined together, what appeared as isolated irregularities begin to align. The first pattern is temporal. From approximately the 1830s through the 1880s, conflicts of similar character ignite globally, not sequentially, but simultaneously. This matters because large-scale operations require planning, logistics, and financing. For multiple empires to engage in prolonged warfare at the same time suggests a shared condition making such campaigns urgent. The second pattern is procedural. The same sequence repeats. A territory is declared unstable, military force is introduced, resistance is reported but vaguely described, conflict extends longer than expected, and finally, the region undergoes administrative reorganization. This isn't merely conquest, it's restructuring. Land systems are dismantled and replaced by standardized frameworks. The same bureaucratic vocabulary appears repeatedly. Pacification, integration, normalization. The third pattern emerges in what remains after wars conclude. We find evidence of earlier sophistication that doesn't fit descriptions of primitive societies. Urban layouts suggesting long-term planning, agricultural systems sustaining large populations, roads aligned with terrain indicating generational knowledge. These systems are attributed to vague predecessors or forgotten builders, creating a narrative gap. The fourth pattern is demographic compression. Population figures stabilize at artificially constrained levels. Census categories change. Ethnic distinctions are flattened. Diversity is reduced administratively. The world becomes easier to manage through gradual, uneven processes that remove certain structures and groups from historical visibility. The fifth pattern is architectural adaptation. Occupying powers repeatedly adapt what they find, rather than building from scratch. Fortresses rise atop older foundations. Administrative buildings occupy sites where civic structures stood. This implies continuity beneath the surface, yet it's never acknowledged. Finally, there's the pattern of synchronization. Conflicts in India, North Africa, Central Asia, North America, and Eastern Europe peak within overlapping time frames. Not identical dates, but close enough to suggest coordination rather than coincidence. Similar military doctrines emerge. Similar administrative reforms follow. Similar demographic transformations occur. Different empires, different languages, different justifications, identical results. Individually, each anomaly can be rationalized. Historians have done so for generations. Records were lost. Circumstances were unique. Sources were biased. The 19th century was complex. But viewed collectively, they